So next up, I want to introduce Daniel Reed. So he is going to tell us about how to reinvent high-performance computing. I've got a little anecdote, and Dan's knows that this is coming. When I first started in HPC, I took an HPC course in 1988, and Walid Abu Safa, who was from University of Illinois, was teaching, and he piped Dan Reed in through video, which was very exotic in 1988, and Dan explained all the reasons why parallel computing might not work. But then he said, but if you could keep on scaling up the size of your problem with each generation of machine, it might work. And so, Dan, it's a pleasure to have you up here to talk about the future of computing. It's very difficult to predict the future, but if anybody can, it'll be Dan. Thank you, sir.
I think John just said I was old, which is true. So when John approached me about giving this talk, he asked me in a good-natured way to try to generate some lively debate and a bit of positive controversy. So that's the spirit in which you should take what I'm about to say, and I'll make a few intentionally good-natured controversial comments. But let me start by giving you a little bit of background. So about a year and a half ago, I wrote a blog post, and then I started some conversations with Jack Dungara and Dennis Gannon and others, and that turned into an extended piece that's an archive article. And then we published an abbreviated version in Communications of the ACM. And there's been some expansion and further conversations since then. And although what I'm about to say, I think both Dennis and Jack agree with, if you disagree or there are inaccuracies or blame me, not them. So one of the things I really want us to do is to start a conversation about the future of HPC. So other perspectives are welcome. In fact, I really want this to be a lively conversation throughout the meeting about where we are and where we're going to go. And so here are some of the things I want you to take away. And if you fall asleep after this slide, that's okay. But the core message is computing itself is an incredibly rapid transition. The hype around AI and the realness of AI in terms of what's happened with ChatGPT, the rise of clouds. It's 15 years ago I was here talking about this cloud thing at HPC. You might want to pay attention to it. Real challenges we're facing in silicon futures, the rise of chiplets and minimax optimizations around that, the energy challenges we know at large scale, and the shifting economics of computing writ large are driving big changes. And because we're part of that, it's driving changes in our world too. And we're increasingly in a situation where the path we're on, if we want more performance, it means putting more euros in the slot, spending more money to build bigger and bigger machines. And there's a political limit to maximum amounts we can spend, and we can talk some about where those are, and they're amorphous, but they are real. The other reality is the free lunch we've depended on for most of the last 30, 40 years is pretty much over. Transistors are actually starting to get more expensive. Can we put more on chips? Yes, we can. But the complexities of smaller transistors are very real, and I'm convinced we may run out of money before we run out of physics. And that's a real concern as we think about what that future might mean. And of course, with all of that, this is the follow the money comment that John started with, that the money and the power have shifted away from the traditional computing vendors to the AI and hyperscalers. And so the message I want you to take away from what I'm going to say is we have to follow the money, but we also have to follow the culture and the technology. So a little bit of history. Think about how we got here. Back when I had hair, I first started in high-performance computing. That was a bad joke. It's actually okay to laugh. And about 1980, I started working, as John said, on this crazy idea that we could build parallel machines, supercomputers, out of inexpensive microprocessors, right? Mind you, this is about the time where the 8086 was state-of-the-art, and the 8286 and the 8287 hadn't appeared yet. So it was a really crazy idea, and it took a while to get traction before that idea came along, but it really did. And we saw a whole succession of custom machines We began to see massively parallel machines. The Paragon, the CM5 are great examples. And then finally, about 2000, we started to deploy production Linux clusters. And I remember when I was the NCSA director and we did that, that was a highly controversial idea. I remember a lot of funding people saying, who the heck is going to provide support? What happens if it breaks? Who's going to fix the software? There's no vendor's neck to wring. And I was like, trust us, this is what open source and community is really about. And of course, that's what happened. But about the same time, Rick Stevens and I started to have a different conversation, and we were just marveling at the Sony PlayStation 2. And if you remember the PS2 when it first came out, the custom vector processors in it, the Emotion engine, phenomenal floating point performance. Now, to be sure, the PS2, like all game systems, was sold as a loss leader to drive money into game cartridges, but phenomenal price performance. And so it was so hard to get a hold of machines, we actually bought a cluster on eBay from Japan because Sony had released a Linux kit for the PS2, and we built a cluster. The word got around, the New York Times called, and about 12.5 nanoseconds later, that number does matter for those of you who remember, the New York Times called, and following that, IBM called, and IBM was working on what became the cell processor. And that was the genesis writ large of what IBM did around Roadrunner at Los Alamos. And I remember telling the Los Alamos folks to not view this as a what-of, but to view it as the first of a family of machines with accelerators. And of course, that's the world that we live in now. And so we're still living in that world, and we've concurrently seen the rise of clouds and the whole set of issues around that. The thing I want you to take away is that the history of high-performance computing is one of punctuated equilibrium. It's this way, it's this way, it's this way, and then it's something different, and it's that way, and that way, and then it's something different. We're in the middle of one of those phase transitions right now. So here's an example of that history. The late Seymour Cray said, as he was designing next-generation crays, would you rather have 2 strong oxen or 1,024 chickens? The chickens won, right? And it took us a while to wrap our heads around the fact that the chickens won, and evolution continued from that, and the world we're in now is actually a monoculture. The diversity in the ecosystem has largely disappeared. Now, those of you vendors may be quick to protest that, no, that's not true, but if you look at a high level at the top 500, it's mostly x86s with some kind of accelerators, mostly NVIDIA accelerators. That did not used to be the case, but it almost universally is now. And so the question really is what comes next as we think about what happened to all those companies that were in that business. So as I said, thinking about punctuated equilibria, remember back how supercomputing started. The lessons we learned about slow memory-to-memory access that ultimately doomed the Cyber 205, the power of low-latency vector access, which we still see in GPU accelerators, the rise of bit slice machines, remember, not super mini computers, but mini supercomputers, right? The days of convex, of Alliant, that day came and went as the microprocessor revolution rolled over it from behind. And the economics of Moore's Law and the Wintel duopoly trumped everything else. And it largely drove competitors out of the ecosystems. And that was really the attack of the killer micros. We're still living in that legacy. And as I said before, the question is, what's really next? So think about the challenges, and I'm sure you've all seen, or many of you have used a version of this old chart that Mark Horowitz and friends originally put together that showed what happened to power, number of cores, thread performance, clock rates. And we largely plateaued on clock rates. I keep thinking we're going to plateau on power, but people are now talking about packages that may have a thermal dissipation of a kilowatt. We've seen continued transistor shrinkage, but we've not seen clock rate increases, again, largely because of thermal issues. But we have certainly seen transistors continue to shrink. But Dennard scaling, that free lunch that let us get smaller, faster, cheaper transistors, ended years ago. And Moore's law, well, you can argue about whether it's over, but you can see the end from here if it hasn't already happened. And that's why I said before, we're probably going to run out of money before we run out of physics. And if we keep scaling down, there is a limit at the bottom. It's called 1 atom. There's only so small you can get. And you can see it from where we are now, right? And as we have gone from planar transistors to FinFETs to gate-all-arounds to talk about, stackable P and N-based transistors and the hierarchy and geometry that's required to continue to shrink, the cost of those transistors is continuing to rise. And there's no miracle, no magic about why we do that. The only reason they keep shrinking is because there is a market that will drive the advantage that comes from that shrinkage. If there isn't a market, it won't happen. There's no magic that's driving this forward. Remember, 2 angstroms is not much. So the question is, what comes next after these things? Because it's clear there is an end in sight. So this is a slide from Jack Dongara that I want to sort of highlight, even within the accelerator GPU world of multicore, what we've seen. And so Jack did an analysis looking at basically the eras of what we've seen in the top 500. Those first few dots there are the very beginning, but you can see 3 different curves there. All right, I'm going to ask a basic math question. What's a straight line on a semi-log plot, class? All right, I was hoping for a little louder answer, but yes, it's an exponential. Thank you. So what happened here? Well, there was a period where we were riding rising clock rates and greater single-core performance, and then about 2004, multicore happened. Why? Because we started to have real thermal dissipation issues, and it became clear that Dennard scaling was about to end. We rode in the top 500 multicore processors, and that's what happened for most of the next decade. That shifted us onto a different curve, actually an even larger exponential in terms of performance increase. But about 2017, we ran out of gas again. And as Moore's law performance slowed, the way we got more performance was we spent more money. We built bigger and bigger systems. So if you look at those generations of what's happening, you might ask yourself, what happens after this? And this is the average number of cores across the machines on the top 500. What happens after this? Because that's why I said at the very outset, right now our option, you want bigger systems when Moore's law is not giving you very much performance increase each generation. If you want a continued exponential when you're only seeing incremental performance every 5 years, you have to spend more money. You have to build a bigger system. And so there's another question about what is our tolerance for scale, which is a polite way not of talking about reliability, algorithmic efficiency. Those are important, don't misunderstand, but how much money are we willing to spend? There's no scenario I can see in which we're willing to stand up a 50 billion euro or dollar supercomputer. Not unless it is some core national security issue that drives topics we can't talk about here. Certainly science is never going to drive that story forward. The other thing I want to hark on a little bit, and those of you who are numerical analysts I think will appreciate this, is the other thing that's been true for most of the last 30 years about what we've been doing in parallel computing is we've been riding weak scaling. Now, to be sure, in the early days, we did not have fine enough meshes. The discretization delta between grid points was not fine enough for us to fully capture the dynamics that we wanted to understand in a lot of complex phenomena. So larger grids with smaller spacings made a whole lot of sense because it gave us understanding of phenomena. It was averaged over at larger scales. But as that has continued, there become other issues, right? Past a certain point, you've got the resolution you need. Going to even finer grids is adding computation, And the real question is the interplay, and it depends on the methods, whether high order or not, and a whole variety of other issues, about what the time to convergence is. But those numbers are at risk as well, potentially, for very large systems and large, complex multiphysics problems. So here's the beginning of my really radical, controversial statement, so please wake up for just a moment. You know, remember the story of Sisyphus? Cheated death, not once, but twice. Punishment was to roll the boulder up the hill for all eternity and have it roll back down. We're trying to cheat death in the end of Moore's Law and think about whether we can continue to do the same thing that we've been doing for most of the last 30 years. There are issues and there are challenges around that. This is an old quote from Gordon Moore, whom we lost a few years ago. And you remember, he's the one who wrote the original popular article with that truly technical title, Cramming More Circuits onto Chips. And what he said was, no exponential is forever, except in the textbooks. And he's right. We have been riding a free lunch exponential for a long time. And one of the lessons of any exponential in reality, as the costs go up, it suggests maybe it's time to start asking different questions. And I'll give you an analogy that's not exactly apt, but it's relevant. Think about what happened to commercial air travel and speeds. From the early 19-teens, Wright Flyer, we saw a steady progression through internal combustion engines and propeller-driven craft. We transitioned to jet engines, speeds kept increasing, and then they stopped, right? The Concorde, for all its technical glory, was not economically viable. The SR-71, which still holds most airspeed records, was a military jet, also not very practical. A tour de force of technology, and if you haven't looked at it, you ought to go look at it. It's an amazing story. But the airplanes that brought us here, those of us who flew here, don't fly any faster than the ones that flew 30 years ago. The locus of innovation changed, don't misunderstand. We continued to innovate, but we shifted because the economics did not really support supersonic transport. Now, there's some question about whether that will change, and I hope it does, but to date, that's not been the case. So we've continued to see innovations in safety, composites, UGG, load management, how to fill planes, avionics, composites, I said, all kinds of places where we've seen innovation, but speeds didn't go up because the economics didn't make it work. We fundamentally are economics driven, and there is a point past which science isn't a big enough argument to move technology forward. There have to be other drivers that make it work. So several of us just participated in the US in a National Academy study that was chaired by Kathy Yellick. Jack was part of it, I was part of it, and so were several others, looking at, in the case of the Department of Energy of the US for its weapons program, the Stockpile Stewardship Program that certifies the effectiveness and safety of nuclear weapons. What is the future of computer modeling? And this is the punchline from the report. It fundamentally said, business as usual won't get us to the future. Business as usual will not get us to the future. And what it says is that the increasing demands for computing, and they clearly are still there, with technology and market challenges, I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a second, mean we have to take an intentional and thorough reevaluation of the entire approach. Acquisition models, algorithms, software, system design, and the workforce issues. It's basically, we need to step back, take a clean sheet of paper, and think about the future. There's an old line attributed to Ernst Rutherford, who, facing a crisis and lack of instrumentation, gathered the people in the lab and said, we have no money, we must think. And that's part of what I'm challenging us to do today. We have money, but we don't have enough. How do we think about what the future will be? So here's maybe a practical way to think about it. there was a time when technical computing was the head of the dog, and it drove a lot of what happened in terms of innovation. We are tail of dog now, and the head of the dog is really AI and hyperscaler. That's where the money is, and most of mainstream computing is being pulled along by it as well. So think about what the goal of a business is, and anybody who sells computers is in the business. It's about maximizing profits, and so how do you do that? You either sell a lot of units with a really low margin, or you sell a small number of units with a really large margin. But it's driven by market opportunities, and your profit, your margin, is of course price minus cost. So I have to tell you an old story about when I was at Microsoft, and I went there to apply HPC ideas to clouds. And at one point, I went to then CEO Steve Ballmer, and I said, Steve, I've got an idea. I have got a pretty good idea about how we can make a few $100 million US a year in technical computing. And he listened patiently to me and said, I'm not interested. And I'm like, did I not convince you? And he's like, no, I actually believe you're right. We could, if we did that, we would make a few $100 million a year, but we're not interested. And I'm like, why? And he said, simple. The opportunity cost is too high, and the margin is too low. And what he meant was, with our money and our people, we could make more money doing something else. And so that is, in the end, the business ethos. How, with our money and our people, do we maximize profits? And there are collateral trade-offs, but that's one of the things that really drives the assessment. So past a certain point, companies will work with governments up to a point, but past that point, governments have to invest in that future for non-technical, non-scientific reasons. And as I said, that relates to either national economic competitiveness or in some cases national security. But it's related to societal benefits, not directly to the economic ones. So when we talk with vendors, we have to keep in mind they are not philanthropic organizations, they're money-making organizations. And when our objectives align, we can work together, but the objectives don't necessarily always align. The other thing that's happened, and if you fall asleep again, please nudge your neighbor. This is the second thing that I really want you to take away. This is a slide I put together several years ago, and I periodically update it with market capitalizations. It's the simplest way I know to drive home how the computing ecosystem has changed. So the ones on the left are a snapshot, not all of them, but a snapshot of the companies we would normally think of as computer companies. The sum of their market capitalizations is less than $1 trillion US. The sum of the market capitalizations. The Asian bat companies are larger, and of course, the hyperscalers and AI companies dwarf everything else. If you look at Apple, it's sitting on, if you subtract debts, it's sitting on over $60 billion of free cash. It's not that different for the other companies. So if you are a computer company, the action you're after is the stuff on the right, because that's where the money is. You're trying to figure out how you get a piece of that action. And if you're a company on the right, you're asking, why should I play with those other people? Because their margin, in other words, their profit margin, is a piece of my cost structure. If I can drive their margin to zero, then I reduce my costs and I maximize my profits. And that translates into either going around those companies and doing internal design, and that's absolutely happening. So the first thing that happened was, why should we buy integrated systems from a vendor when they're going, in many cases, to a Taiwanese integrator themselves? So bypass a vendor, go directly there. Then it was, well, we build networks bigger than anybody else in the world. Why are we buying network hardware that looks like it has gold bullion hidden inside when we can build our own networks? Started to do that. Same thing has happened with memory technology and processors, right? Not only specifications of SKUs, stock keeping units, in other words, the specs of what I want, but why am I buying processors when I could design them own, optimized for the workloads that I have? So the ecosystem power shift is pretty dramatic, and it shifted away from the traditional computing vendors, where a few $100 million is a lot of money, but if you're a Microsoft or a Google and you're dropping $500 million every 6 months to build a new data center, a supercomputer at $500 million bought every 5 years looks like noise. And that's part of the political and economic dynamic that we have to face up to. Love this quote. And it appeared on Twitter last month from Daniel Bowers. And he said about that AI thing, HPC and AI, they're totally different. HPC is large, expensive clusters of GPUs running arcane algorithms with PhDs who belittle AI. But AI is large, expensive clusters of GPUs running arcane algorithms for PhDs who belittle HPC. The point is, they really are the same thing. I mean, yes, the algorithms are different, but many of the underlying technology issues are the same, and the opportunity we have is leveraging that. Let's be honest. If GPUs hadn't been driven by dynamics other than just HPC, we would not have the HPC performance we have today. You know, both hyperscalers, AI, Bitcoin mining, and graphics, you know, are big drivers for those. HPC is mostly along for the ride. So let's talk a little bit more about deep learning. And I told some people before I came, if I didn't say the words large language model and AI, they probably revoke my honorary geek status. So note for the record, I use both phrases here right now. So we know all the ferment and fury and excitement that's taken place around ChatGPT for the last few months has been driven by the fact that its performance on a wide variety of tasks that we have historically viewed as the sole province of humans is actually as good at or better than we are. This chart on the right shows basically the point where a whole variety of techniques, from language translation to handwriting recognition to identifying features in images, AIs are better than humans. As I told a dean at my university the other day, the sad truth is ChatGPT is a better writer than most of our undergraduates will ever be. That's a serious issue when you think about it. So what really happened here in the last few years? Because I'm old enough to have lived through multiple AI winners when the hype for AI was, oh, it's going to change the world, and then it fizzled. We'll see what happens this time, but I think it's different. What changed was the quality of the results, right? That they are better than what humans can do. What made that happen? Well, it turns out bigger actually is better. And so if you look at this chart, which is drawn from this X-Archive paper that looks at the eras of machine learning, it has gone through itself. And remember what I said about plots and semi-log axes. This is the scale and size of machine models over the last several years. They have grown dramatically. In fact, there are lots of estimates out there, and you can debate because no one is talking, but there's a good chance that ChatGPT, its training required over 3 times 10 to the 25 flops. That's months to years of exascale class computing. Think about any computational model we would run that we could justify devoting a calendar year to running that model. That's a pretty short list. Not because there aren't problems that might require that, but because the political dynamics of sharing a machine across domains are very real. The economics are what make this work. The fact that you could run an exaclass computation for a year is because you can make money doing that. That's what's driving it. It's also driving what's happening in the innovation space around the underlying technology. And so I put a couple of Nature covers up there. You know, one was about protein folding, the other was about Go, and both of those were AI breakthroughs. And I want to foreshadow something I'm going to say in just a moment. We've been trying to solve the protein folding problem for the last 25 years. making very incremental progress. This was a radically different approach. Converged on answers, almost universally verifiable true in a very small amount of time. One of the other things I want you to think about is the language and worldview we have about models also have to expand. And Tom Gibbs, if you're out there, can I get an amen? How we think about the world shapes the way we think about solutions. And so we have to think a little more broadly. So that's what's driving all the innovation. There were billion-dollar startups in the hardware AI space and software AI space, and some of them are actually in the trade show floor. Go talk to them. Google has spent tons of money building multiple generations of TPUs to accelerate machine learning. And I'm sure that you'll hear about that in one of the later talks. Amazon has built custom ARM processors, right? The Gravitons are an example of that. Microsoft, whom Torsten and I still can't talk about what they're doing, are doing really interesting things in the hardware space. And of course, just a few days ago, Ampere announced its 192-core processor as well. That's the only one on this list that you can buy with money. Let me say that again, because it's really important. That last one on the list from Ampere, it's the only one you can buy the hardware with money. The others are captive. And so that's another sea change that's happened in the ecosystem. The hardware that the hyperscalers are developing is not available for purchase. The services running on top of that hardware is available for purchase because that's where the money is. But it's not just acceleration of search or learning. Amazon has been doing protocol offload for networks for years. There are lots of examples of that, of specialization of hardware, the offload function to reduce the cost price point, drive up the performance of the delivered service. So think about a world where most of the innovation in hardware, or at least a large fraction of the innovation in hardware, is happening in companies that won't sell you the hardware. It means we have to think about a different collaboration model that creates a different interplay with the folks who are driving a lot of the technical innovation. It doesn't mean there's no space for the traditional computing vendors. There always will be. But it does mean we have to think about a different world where the locus of innovation has shifted. So what does this mean? Here are a couple of lines from Alice in Wonderland where Alice says, which way should I go? And the cat says, well, that depends on where you're going. She says, I don't know. And the cat says, well, then it doesn't much matter which way you go. And that's kind of the question I think we have to ask ourselves. Which way do we want to go, and how do we get there? What's the path? So I'm going to make a few really radical statements in the hopes of inflaming some discussion. And so these are intentionally provocative. I'm not sure I completely believe all of them myself, but I at least believe part of them. So let's start with the future of the traditional models. As the risk, the financial, technical, political risk of building ever larger machines continues to grow, the number of vendors willing to take on that risk in the traditional procurement model is shrinking. In the US, we're effectively down to only one integrator for high-end HPC systems. And it's not much different any place else. So here's kind of what it means. I approach you as a vendor and I say, I got a few $100 million, maybe in the high end, several $100 million. I want you to build me a machine with the latest, maybe not yet existent technology. And I have a deadline for when you want to I want that to happen. That's a high-risk endeavor, and the truth is, in the grand scheme of things, as I said, showing the market capitalization chart, €1 billion, $1 billion, it ain't what it used to be. It's not that much money anymore. And so our leverage is limited. And so one of the questions is, what happens if we show up and nobody wants to play? Or very few people want to play? The other is bigger has some practical limits. How much is the EU, the US, Japan, other countries willing to spend on science-driven HPC systems? There is a political limit there, and it's bigger than now, but you can see it from where we are. I talked about some of the challenges about weak scaling, and the reality is, although we still drive innovation, we're not the primary driver anymore. And that means we have to think about some different kinds of models and how we collaborate. So here's what's really hard for us. When vector processors and SMPs ran out of steam, when Echo ran out of steam and we switched to CMOS, it was pretty obvious what to do next. There had been a long history of research in parallel computing and message passing systems and high-performance CMOS microprocessors. We jumped off one bandwagon onto another, and we've been riding the Moore's Law curve for most of the last 30 years. It's less obvious what bandwagon to jump onto now. So it's clear that COTS, commercial off-the-shelf, is still part of the answer, but it's not all of the answer. It can't be. Quantum, I don't know. I used to run Microsoft's Quantum Research Group, among other things. We've got a long way to go before we get to thousands of reliable qubits. We've got some number of highly unreliable physical qubits, but we need thousands of reliable logical qubits to be able to do the kind of things we want to do. Even if we get that, we still have to face a reality, which is, as we know, looking at a quantum state causes it to collapse. If your computation requires real-time data assimilation, you got a problem with quantum. Because it is much like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Ask it a question, it computes for a long time, and it says 42. So there is a real space of material science problems where it will be transformative, but I am skeptical that it will be a general purpose solution for the future of all of computing. Back to my comment about models, we've been riding discretization of PDEs since the end of the Second World War, and it's been a powerful approach, and it will continue to be, but it's only one kind of model. The late statistician George Box had an interesting comment about models. He said, all models are wrong. And he's right, because models by definition are simplifications of the real system. But he said, some models are useful. All models are wrong, some models are useful. What kind of models do we think about? And that was the reason for my pitch about the lesson of protein folding and machine learning was it's a different kind of model approach than the one we have historically used. Most of us in this room are old enough to believe that 64-bit IEEE floating point is one of those laws of nature. It's not, right? It was a technical compromise. There are cool things you can do with other formats, and that's what machine learning has showed, that 8-bit and 16-bit floats, you can do really interesting things. And so how we think about that is a different set of issues, and people like Jack are spending a lot of time thinking about that. But here's the other thing to think about floating point. Von Neumann was pretty skeptical of floating point. He said anybody who needs floating point doesn't really understand the dynamic scaling and the problem. And you should be able to figure this out yourself. Now, a lot of things were easy for von Neumann that might not be easy for the rest of us, so take that with a grain of salt. But it's not the only path either. And then if you think as well about the other pieces, clearly there is a big opportunity for how we embrace deep learning and large language models. But this is the other thing I want us to think about. There is a hypothesis in language called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it's waxed and waned in its credibility, but the gist of what it says is the language, and to some extent it literally means the language, but more broadly, the worldview that you hold shapes how you think. And so it puts implicit barriers around your worldview that says, well, the space of things I can think about have to be consistent with this worldview. If you can shift into another worldview, you open up another space that you can think about. And that's really what I think is our opportunity and is our challenge. As a science fiction writer, Neil Stephenson said, if we want a better future, got to start with better dreams. So what are some better dreams? But here's the other thing. A dream that can't get traction is just a fantasy. It's a hallucination. The dreams that matter are the ones that can get some traction, and that means they have to have political traction, they've got to have economic traction, and they have to be technically viable. They've got to have some technical traction. And so Thomas Kuhn's The Nature or the Structure of Scientific Revolutions is really about how you think about these phase transitions from one domain to another. So we've got a shifting manufacturing landscape, which is really driven by what we all saw during COVID about supply chain logistics and the problems with that, but also the intense geopolitical competition around semiconductors, who's manufacturing them. The EU is investing, the US is investing, China is investing. You know, how that's going to play out, I don't know, but it is an intense geopolitical issue. Underlying all of that, of course, are the basic silicon challenges I mentioned at the outset, right? The end of Moore's law, whether it's here or not, don't know, but you can see the end from here. There are issues around that. And so, despite all that, we're surrounded by opportunities. Opportunities in new materials and devices and architectures and algorithms and software. What we have to do is seize the opportunity, let go of some of our existing worldview. And so here's Dan's hypothesis. There really is an exciting way forward. This is probably the most exciting time to be in computing in some ways in the last 20 years, because there's a phase transition happening. But it means we're going to have to build different kinds of partnerships. Follow the money. Think about how we partner with the AI and hyperscalers, not the exclusion of the traditional vendors, but in addition to them. It means a different ethos and cultural shift. And it means that we have to be honest that we're in a shifting world. You know, the world of globalization is pulling back to some multilateralism in some different ways. Not making a social comment on the good or bad of that, I'm just stating that's a political reality. That's affecting the world in which we live. So let me sort of wrap up with a couple of quick things, because I'm just about out of time. We're in a new world. We've got to move from this Moore's law, Dennard scaling PC ecosystem to one where we could do mass customization. And here's part of the challenge, very quickly. The price of transistors, it bottomed out several years ago, and although we can put more on chips, they're rising. There are only 2 or 3 global vendors that can build state-of-the-art semiconductors. And chiplets are our opportunity. And let me tell you why. And this is really the punchline. We all live through a world where lots of people try to build custom machines and they all failed. Here's why the world is different now. In a Moore's law world, we had to beat 2x performance every 18 months. We had to build complete systems. In this world, all we have to do is build a piece of a system and put it into an existing system. So piecewise optimization, you can build a chiplet for the price of a startup. There are real opportunities to innovate there, and it gives us this choice of, do you want bigger systems with lower node performance or smaller systems with higher node performance? We could do that. So we got to build a beat them and join them strategy. We have to be tall enough to attack the city. We've got to think about this chiplet optimization problem for core motifs. It doesn't mean every machine has to be different, but there do have to be opportunities and recognize the economics. And this is the last thing I want you to think about. Why we need a different worldview. Our big machines don't work like ours do, and to be sure, these are lossy, error-prone as well, but they're proof points. If I stood here and held on my fingertip a semiconductor chip and I said, this thing can do both land and air locomotion, has rich vision and obstacle avoidance systems, it's an autonomous goal-seeking entity, it uses milliwatts, man, if you were a vendor, you'd be beating a path to find out what that technology is. That's what nature does all the time, right? It builds these cheap systems that can do this. There are some lessons to be learned there. So I'm going to make an appeal. Let's think about real neural networks, not artificial ones that draw on nature and do some different kinds of things. And with that, thanks for the chance to talk to you. Let's go reinvent HPC. Thanks.
Great. Great. Thanks, Dan, for that fantastic talk. That was everything I was hoping for. So we're entering now the question and answer. We have about 12 minutes left. Now, you have the microphones here, and the two in the back. Please come up, say where you're from, and ask your question of Dan. And I'm also up here to monitor the swap card app. So if you're shy, please put your question into the swap card. All right. Well, so maybe I'll have to.
Oh, come on.
Come on, people. Oh, there you go.
Yep. So Marek from Cambridge University Mathematics faculty. So actually I'm a particle physicist by training, right away, just to give a bit of context. So anyway, the thing is, the way you have described it, it kind of partially meshes what I also know from the open source world, from FOSDEM, for instance, where people have been talking about glowing proprietarization of the world. Essentially, the cloud computing is essentially large proprietary black box systems, and now we know it from you that it's not just about the software, it's also about the hardware. And the break you're closing up, they are pulling us in, locking us in, making it difficult to move. Then we move on to the neural networks and so on, where you already know that some of the AI or machine learning, however you call it, that they actually cheat. They do something else. We think they do, just the result happens to be what we expect them to do. So I think there's a bit of a problem with, it clashes with the nature of openness of research, in my opinion, that we are being pushed into black boxes and trust us approach. How do you think we can reconcile this? I mean, you kind of mentioned this semi-bespoke systems, but I would like you to elaborate on how you think we can continue staying open, given where the money is taking us.
So we've never been completely open. I mean, the world of large vendors has always been there. Certainly in the days of, the glory days of IBM, of HP, of Data General, there weren't many choices if you wanted to buy computer hardware. And yeah, if you locked into an ecosystem, you would continue to buy from them. That hasn't really changed. It has in some ways always been that way. And so I would say here's one of the conundra that we face in high-performance computing that distinguishes us, say, from high-energy physics or astronomy, where we build custom bespoke instruments, but there is no economic system that supports those constructions. The world market for James Webb telescopes is one. And there's no economic model I can think of where someone would say, if I built one of those, I could sell 100 more. So that's a world where we invest in science purely for science-driven reasons. There is another world in which we go to that for computing, but it will mean that our computing systems will be a lot more expensive and we can make them open, but the machines that we're building would cost billions of dollars, not hundreds of millions of dollars or euros, because we would not be riding that commercial ecosystem. That's the yin and the yang we have to trade off. We're getting a partial free ride on top of the commercial ecosystem, and that's always been the tension in scientific computing. We're not purely building bespoke scientific instruments, we're leveraging things. Now, to be sure, if you're building particle detectors or accelerators, you're leveraging an ecosystem as well, but you control the architecture, the software, everything else. So we sort of have to accept that trade-off. For a lower price, we have to accept some other things. We could choose a different model. I will tell you, I think there's probably little government appetite for that at any place in the world, because part of the reason why they want that coupling is they want the scientific enterprise to keep injecting innovation into the system. And the reason has, I'll say it just this directly, not directly to do with scientific discovery, it has to do with national competitiveness and national security. Governments want a vibrant ecosystem in their countries and their regions that they can control. Not in a micro sense, but in a sense, it is part of our economy. And that's the world we live in. We could make a political choice, but it would have economic consequences.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so we're gonna bounce back and forth between swap card and you guys, so you'll be next and then you. Simon Hammond asks in swap card, Dan, great talk. For sites with hundreds of legacy science applications, how do you suggest that we continue to support existing science, even though the world where they have much bigger, non-traditional HPC dreams?
Well, I don't think it's an either-or, and although I suggested we need to think more broadly about different kinds of models, I don't mean to suggest we abandon the history of what we've done. It's been incredibly successful. I think the real question that we need to ask is, when do we specialize and when do we take advantage of commodities? And you can do a really interesting mathematical analysis of this. Neil Thompson at MIT did a great study. You think about why all the custom machines we built over the years died, it was because they got rolled over by Moore's law. But when you're only seeing 5 to 8% performance increase a year, that dynamic changes. So how many units do you have to build in order to amortize that NRE, the non-recurring engineering cost, and the opportunity cost to be able to build something specialized? And you actually do that math and figure out when, as I said, you don't have to build a completely new machine. You say, this is the core motif of the majority of the applications I have to support. Let me build, either directly or in partner, some semi-custom silicon that optimizes the heck out of that. I'll plug it into the existing ecosystem. I may have to change the compilers and some of the runtime system, but most of the ecosystem persists, and then I am golden. So that, I think, is the real opportunity for us. It's that tension between specialization and generality. We have real opportunities there, but the legacy is always going to be there. But on the other hand, and this is the last thing I'll say, some of us in this room remember when abandoning vectors to go to MPI, it's like, this is death. You know, you will drag vectors from my cold, dead hands before I give up and embrace distributed memory. And of course, the performance gap became so large that ultimately most of those recalcitrants gave in and adapted message-based parallel processing. And of course, the irony is, if they just hung on there with vector accelerators and GPUs, vectors were coming back. In fact, I used to give a talk with the following title, and it was about where the future was going to go. Chainsaws, beavers, or termites? Which one's going to win? Well, I told you that the beavers, i.e. the chickens, won, but the truth is it's all of those things, right? And that's the opportunity. So we're always going to have to support that, figure out when it's possible to migrate. And I guess the last thing I would say about this is, the lesson that we've learned as we've chased extreme performance more and more is that every step function, we leave more applications behind.
All right, to the right here.
Hi, Eric Hunter, a global futurist with B&B Innovation Futures.
Yeah.
Writing today for HPC Wire. Question for you on the better dreams aspect that you've been talking about. What are your thoughts towards more of a biointegration perspective, particularly from the brain, where you'll have evolutions in the brain which we can currently see when using a lot of that front-end facing technology you talked about, whether it's Amazon, Facebook, ChatGPT, et cetera. What are your thoughts more on the study of brain evolution with this as you start to bring in these mixed reality augmentations and projecting forward, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm an expert to comment on brain evolution, though. The point I was trying to make about trying to model biology in terms of spiking neuron networks is the way artificial neural networks work, any of the varieties that we're running, they don't look like how nature models neurons. You know, they're always on, they're synchronous, they're high power, and if we know anything about brains, well, first of all, they're not always all on, but they're not synchronous and they're low power, and they're trigger-based. And so in that sweet spot of what you might do in biology versus what you might do in biology-inspired computing with not artificial neural networks, but systems that better model real neurons, I think there's a real opportunity there. But I hark back to what I said before. It will require a different worldview and a different set of models, a different way of thinking about the world than we embrace now. Because one of the complaints is, well, we're error prone. The truth is, so are our large machines, and we spend a lot of time on error correction, but we got a whole lot of silent errors in there that we don't know about either.
Right, thank you. Next up.
Hi, my name is Sanskriti Deva, and I'm an undergrad at North Carolina State University, and we're a bunch of undergrads attending. And I was wondering what we can do in addition to our coursework as young people to keep up with the future of high-powered computing.
Keep dreaming. You're the future. I mean that literally. There's an old saw in science, the way that new ideas take hold is old scientists die. I'm getting closer. But joking aside, it is the fact that you bring a fresh perspective to things means you can look at the world through fresh eyes, question assumptions. One of the great things about this business is the questions don't change, but the answers do, because they're motivated and constrained by technology. So keep asking both the same questions and new questions, and take a broad multidisciplinary view, because the infusion of ideas from other disciplines is also what shapes that worldview.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so we're going to ask a question and swap card here. So Sergey Bogart says, thank you for your brilliant invitation to reinvent HPC. Your argument largely relies on a business profit statement, which is relevant today, but what about the coming end of the growing model that nature will put in front of us?
I'm not quite sure what that means. It is true that what I was trying obliquely to say with the end of Moore's law is there is a world in which computers stop getting faster. And I realize that's a really heretical thought for us, but there is a world in which computers stop getting faster. At some point, at least the path we're on, it's going to run out of economic gas, and it's going to run out of the economics that will let us continue to explore more exotic physics, which means we either have to find a different economic or technical or social model, or, like airplanes, they stop flying faster and we focus on other loci of innovation. And I don't know when that's going to happen, but I do know if we don't do something differently, it will happen. And that's really both our opportunity and our challenge.
All right. And last question.
All right.
Very last.
Morning, Dan.
Morning, Broadus.
Livermore. So, you wanted controversy, so you know me, I'll try and generate some for you.
Great.
So, I'll try and rattle them off. So we've got Facebook, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Apple. So, yeah, they do make use some hardware, and they even deploy some hardware. But those are 5 software companies. And while you race through it at the end of your talk, you kind of largely focused on hardware. So my question is, when you want to have a strategy of joining them, when you're talking about software companies, why on earth would you focus on hardware?
Because they're building some of the most interesting hardware in the world, and they have more money to do it than anybody else. So they have more money than the silicon vendors, and they're driving mostly what the foundries do. So being connected to that ecosystem is a way to have influence. So that's one of the reasons. On the software front, since you asked, I'll throw a rock back, okay? Which is our MPI libraries Linux model is getting kind of long in the tooth. The other reason to think about partnering with an alternative ecosystem is there are things they can learn from us, and we've certainly seen that in some of what's happening in AI accelerators. But there is a heck of a lot we can learn from them about software development, about resilience, about scale, about services. That's really hard for us to internalize in our current ecosystem. And so there is mutual benefit there, but we have to get out of the mode of saying, we're the experts, we'll tell you what we want, to, we know some of the questions, we may know some of the answers, but we don't know all of either one. Let's sit down and work together and think about what that future could be. Because as I said in response to one of the first questions, the money is going to drive what happens. And that money either comes from the private sector, driven by profit incentives, or it comes from governments, the EU, the US, other governments. And the truth is, in this space, governments are poor. The amount of money they can devote to this space is small compared to what those hyperscalers have on hand, because the economic engine that's driving them right now is as powerful or more powerful than the days when IBM was the colossus that bestrode the computing world. It's a new era and a new set of opportunities. So the message is we got to learn from each other, but we got to approach both sides with some degree of humility. We know some things. There are things we don't know. Let's work together.
All right. With that, thank you very much, Dan. Pleasure.